The crack of the rifle echoed through the jungle canopy at 9:17 in the morning on January 22, 1943. 240 yards away, a Japanese soldier lurched backward through the branches of a massive banyan tree, his scoped Arisaka clattering as it tumbled 90 feet to the jungle floor below. Second Lieutenant John George worked the bolt of his Winchester Model 70, ejecting the spent cartridge, and chambered another round. His breathing remained steady, his hands controlled. He had just eliminated the first of 11 enemy snipers who had been systematically hunting American soldiers in the Point Cruz groves of Guadalcanal. Over the past 72 hours, these Japanese marksmen had taken 14 American lives. The battalion commander had given George one morning to prove that his civilian hunting rifle could actually work in combat. What followed over the next 4 days would not only save countless lives, but would fundamentally change how the United States military approached sniper warfare. If you're fascinated by these forgotten stories of individual heroism and precision in World War II, hit that subscribe button now. We dive deep into the battles, the weapons, and the warriors that changed history, bringing you the facts and details that most documentaries miss. The marksman nobody believed. In John George arrived at Guadalcanal with something that made his fellow officers laugh. A mail order, Winchester rifle with a civilian scope purchased from his own pocket. George was no ordinary soldier. He was an Illinois state shooting champion who had competed at Camp Perry, the legendary marksmanship competition that had been the proving ground for American shooters since 1907. Camp Perry taught precision, patience, and the kind of breathing control that separated amateurs from masters. George had spent years perfecting his craft on the ranges, where wind, light, and even his own heartbeat became variables he learned to control. But the United States Army in 1942 had no official sniper program, no doctrine for precision shooting in combat, and certainly no respect for a man who brought his own sporting rifle to war. The Winchester Model 70 that George carried was a bolt-action rifle chambered in .30-06 Springfield, the same caliber used in the standard M1903 Springfield service rifle. The Model 70 featured a controlled round feed action, an internal 5-round magazine, and a reputation for exceptional accuracy that had made it the favorite of competitive shooters and big game hunters across America. George's rifle had a barrel length of 24 inches and weighed approximately 7.5 pounds without the scope. The scope itself was the source of endless ridicule from his fellow officers. It was an 8-power Unertl target scope, the same type that would later be officially adopted by the United States Marine Corps for sniper operations. But in January 1943, it was just another piece of mail-order equipment that had no place in a real soldier's kit, according to the brass. George's battalion, the 132nd Infantry Regiment, had been fighting on Guadalcanal since December of 1942. They were part of the American Division, United States Army forces that had relieved the exhausted Marines who had held Henderson Field through months of brutal combat. By January 1943, the campaign was entering its final phase. The Japanese were preparing for Operation K, the evacuation of their remaining forces from the island. But they were not simply running. They were fighting rear-guard actions covering their withdrawal routes with machine gun nests, fortified positions, and sniper teams that made every American advance a calculation of blood and time. The area west of Point Cruz, where George's battalion was operating, presented terrain that turned conventional infantry tactics into nightmares. The jungle was not the romantic vision of tropical paradise, but a claustrophobic maze of massive trees draped in vines, where visibility rarely exceeded 10 to 50 meters and often dropped to nearly zero when rain and fog rolled in. The banyan trees grew to heights exceeding 100 feet, their trunks so wide that 4 men could not link arms around them, and their canopy so dense that the jungle floor existed in permanent twilight. Streams cut through the terrain, turning the ground into sucking mud that grabbed at boots and made silent movement impossible. The temperature hovered in the 90s, humidity near saturation, and every uniform became soaked with sweat within minutes of dawn. In this environment, Japanese snipers had developed tactics that exploited every advantage. They climbed into the canopy before dawn and strapped themselves to branches with rope or canvas harnesses, sacrificing mobility for concealment and elevation. They wore camouflage made from local vegetation, changing it daily to match the light and foliage around their positions. Their rifles were Arisaka Type 98 bolt actions, chambered in 6.5 millimeter or 7.7 millimeter depending on the model, and equipped with 4 power scopes. These weapons lacked the range and stopping power of George's .30-06, but they were more than adequate for the distances involved in jungle fighting. The Japanese marksmen understood patience in a way that terrified American troops. They would wait for hours, sometimes entire days, for a single shot at a target of value, an officer, a radio operator, a machine gunner. By mid-January 1943, the snipers operating in the Point Cruz groves had become a crisis. 14 Americans had been eliminated in 72 hours, and the battalion's advance had slowed to a crawl. Soldiers moved through the jungle with their heads down, rifles raised, eyes constantly scanning the canopy. Every sound, every movement of leaves, every bird call became a potential threat. Entire platoons would halt for minutes at a time when a single shot cracked through the jungle, trying to determine the direction, the distance, the position of a shooter they could not see. The psychological effect was devastating. Men who had faced Japanese bayonet charges without flinching now hesitated to cross open ground or fill canteens at streams. Captain Morris, the battalion operations officer, made the decision that brought George into the fight. Morris had heard about George's background, his championships at Camp Perry, his insistence on bringing that civilian rifle to combat. Most officers had dismissed George as a fanatic, a gun enthusiast, who did not understand that war was about volume of fire and unit cohesion, not about precision shooting. But Morris was desperate. The snipers were costing him men and time and conventional tactics, sending patrols to search the trees, having squads fire blindly into the canopy, calling in artillery on suspected positions, had accomplished nothing except wasted ammunition. Morris called George to battalion headquarters on the evening of January 21st and gave him a simple mission: find the snipers, eliminate them. George was given operational freedom to work alone or with a spotter as he chose. He was assigned to the Point Cruz groves, the area where the sniper activity was most concentrated. Morris told him he had one morning to prove his rifle, and his skills were worth anything. George cleaned his Winchester that night, checking the bore, the action, the scope, mounts. He loaded his ammunition carefully, 30-06 M2 ball cartridges, 173 grain boat tail bullets, traveling at approximately 2,700 feet per second out of the muzzle. He studied maps of the Point Cruz area, marking locations where Americans had been hit, trying to identify patterns in the attacks. Then he tried to sleep, knowing that dawn would bring the kind of shooting that could not be practiced on any range. Into the groves, George moved into position at 0700 hours on January 22nd. He chose a shattered Japanese bunker as his observation post, a concrete and log structure that American artillery had cracked open days earlier, but that still provided cover and a clear field of view toward the groves to the west. The bunker smelled of cordite and something worse, the sweet rot of bodies left in tropical heat. George ignored it. He set up his rifle on sandbags, checked his sight picture, and began the work of hunting. The first rule of counter-sniper operations is patience. George understood that the Japanese were watching just as he was watching. They had seen the American advance, knew the positions of the forward units, and had already selected their hides in the canopy. George's advantage was not in firepower or numbers, but in his ability to see what others missed. He scanned the tree line slowly, methodically, using the 8-power magnification of his inertial scope to search for anomalies in the pattern of branches and leaves. He was not looking for a man. He was looking for straight lines in a place of curves, for shadows that fell wrong, for colors that did not match the surrounding vegetation. At 08:51, nearly 2 hours after he had begun his watch, George spotted the first sniper. The man was not in a tree. He was on the ground, positioned behind a fallen log, approximately 190 yards northwest of George's bunker. The sniper had made a mistake that George's trained eye caught immediately. The man had shifted his weight, causing a slight movement in the foliage he had piled in front of his position for concealment. It was less than an inch of motion, barely visible even through the scope, but it was enough. George settled the crosshairs on the sniper's position, controlled his breathing, let out half a breath, and squeezed the trigger. The Winchester's report was sharp and loud in the morning air, not the crack of a military rifle, but the deeper boom of a sporting gun designed for killing large game at distance. The Japanese sniper collapsed forward over his log. George worked the bolt, ejecting the spent casing and chambering a fresh round from the internal magazine. He did not celebrate. He continued scanning. 7 minutes later, at 08:58, he found a second target. This one was in the trees, approximately 60 yards north of the first kill, positioned in the lower branches of a banyan where the trunk split into multiple limbs. The sniper had heard the first shot and was now searching for George's position, scanning with his scoped Arisaka. George saw the glint of the scope lens as the man turned his head. It was a fraction of a second of reflected light, but it gave George the precise location he needed. He fired. The second sniper fell through the branches, his body tumbling and crashing through foliage before hitting the ground. George relocated immediately after the second shot. This was not target shooting at Camp Perry, where you could fire multiple rounds from the same bench rest. Every shot revealed his position to any enemy who understood angles and sound. He moved north, low and fast, to a fallen tree 120 yards from the destroyed bunker. The tree provided solid cover and a different field of view over the groves. George settled in and resumed his watch. The morning heated up. Sweat ran into his eyes. Insects, large black flies, and mosquitoes swarmed around him. He ignored them. His focus was absolute. At 9:43, nearly an hour after the second kill, George spotted the third sniper. This one was 240 yards out, high in another banyan strapped to a branch with canvas webbing. The distance was extreme for jungle shooting, where humidity and temperature variations affected bullet trajectory in ways that were difficult to calculate. George adjusted his aim slightly, compensating for the drop and the wind that moved through the canopy. He fired. The Japanese soldier jerked and fell backward, his body plunging 90 feet and hitting the jungle floor near the base of the tree. 3 shots, 3 kills. George reloaded his Winchester from a stripper clip. His hands were steady. His breathing was controlled. This was exactly what he had trained for, except now the targets shot back. At 11:21, a Japanese bullet struck the sandbag 6 inches from George's head. The round punched through the canvas and sprayed dirt into his face. George did not flinch. The shot had come from the southeast, a direction he had not been covering. He realized immediately what had happened. The Japanese had sent additional snipers into the groves to hunt him. They had triangulated his position from his muzzle flash and the sound of his shots. George grabbed his rifle and ran. He sprinted through the undergrowth, vines catching his boots, branches whipping his face. Japanese rifle fire followed him, bullets snapping past and striking trees. He covered 90 yards before diving into a shell crater, a blast hole from American artillery that provided temporary cover. George waited in the crater for 10 minutes, listening, watching. No more shots. The Japanese were waiting for him to move again. He understood the tactical situation. He had killed 3 snipers, but now the hunters had become the hunted. He could retreat to American lines and report his success, or he could stay and continue the mission. George chose to stay. The hunt intensifies. Over the next 3 hours, George played a deadly game of movement and concealment. He would set up in a position, scan the groves for targets, take a shot if he found one, then immediately relocate before return fire could zero in on him. It was exhausting work, physically and mentally. Each move required him to navigate through jungle terrain while carrying his rifle and remaining as silent as possible. Each setup required him to find cover, establish a stable shooting position, and reacquire his field of view through the scope. Each shot required absolute precision because a miss would not only waste ammunition but would reveal his position for no gain. At 12:30, George eliminated his fourth target, a sniper positioned in a palm tree approximately 150 yards to the west. At 1300 hours, he took down a fifth, a man who had made the mistake of moving along a ridgeline where his silhouette broke the horizon for a fraction of a second. At 1440, George fired at a sixth target and saw the man fall from his perch in the canopy. By 1500 hours, George had been hunting for 8 hours straight without food or water. His uniform was soaked through with sweat. His hands were scraped and bleeding from climbing through the undergrowth. His face was swollen from insect bites. But he had fired 12 rounds and achieved 8 confirmed kills. Captain Morris sent a runner at 1700 hours to bring George back to American lines. Morris wanted numbers, wanted to know if his gamble on the marksman with the mail-order rifle had paid off. George reported 8 confirmed kills over approximately 9 hours of operations, 12 rounds fired, 8 hits, 4 misses. It was a success rate of 66% under combat conditions in dense jungle against targets that were actively hunting him. Morris was impressed, but not satisfied. 8 kills meant that at least 3 of the original 11 snipers were still out there, still hunting American soldiers. Morris told George to clean his rifle and rest, because he was going back out in the morning. That night, George stripped and cleaned the Winchester by lamplight in his tent. He inspected every component of the rifle, checking for any sign of wear or damage that could affect accuracy. He cleaned the bore with solvent and patches until they came out white. He checked the scope mounts, ensuring they were still tight after the day's movements. He reloaded his ammunition pouches, counting out rounds, organizing them by lot number to ensure consistency. He ate cold rations and drank water, forcing himself to consume calories and fluids his body needed. Then he tried to sleep, knowing that the next day would bring more of the same, except now the Japanese knew exactly what he was doing and would be waiting for him. January 23rd began before dawn. George moved back into the Point Cruz groves at first light, approaching from a different direction than the previous day. He understood that the Japanese would have anticipated his return and would be watching his previous positions. He chose a new observation post, a drainage ditch approximately 200 yards west of where he had operated the day before. The ditch was uncomfortable, muddy, and cramped, but it provided excellent concealment and a good field of view over a section of the groves he had not yet covered. George spent the first 2 hours of daylight simply watching, not shooting, not moving, just observing. He was looking for patterns in the jungle, for areas that seemed too quiet or too active, for positions that offered the kind of elevation and concealment that a trained sniper would choose. At 0920, he spotted movement in a tree approximately 180 yards to the northwest. It was not the movement of wind in branches or a bird changing perches. It was controlled, deliberate, human movement. George tracked it through his scope until he identified the target, a Japanese soldier climbing higher into the canopy, repositioning to get a better field of fire over the American advance. George waited until the man stopped moving and settled into his position. Then he fired. The 9th sniper fell, crashing through branches on his way to the ground. George immediately shifted his aim, scanning the area around the kill. This was a tactic he had developed through experience. Snipers often worked in pairs, one as the primary shooter and one as a spotter. If you eliminated one, there was a good chance the other was nearby. At 0947, George's patience was rewarded. A second Japanese soldier who had been concealed in foliage at the base of the same tree broke cover and began moving. George led the target, compensated for the man's speed and direction, and fired. The 10th sniper went down. 10 snipers eliminated over 2 days. 1 remained. George knew that the 11th would be the most dangerous, the smartest, the most experienced of the group. This was the man who had survived while his comrades fell, who had learned from watching George work, who understood tactics and patience on a level that matched George's own skills. This was no longer a hunt. It was a duel. The final duel. George spent the rest of January 23rd searching for the 11th sniper without success. He moved through multiple positions, scanned thousands of square yards of jungle, waited for hours in concealment, but found nothing. The remaining Japanese marksmen had gone to ground, hiding so effectively that even George's trained eye could not locate him. As darkness fell, George returned to American lines and reported his progress to Captain Morris. 10 confirmed kills, 11 shots fired against snipers. Morris was pleased but emphasized that the job was not finished. As long as one sniper remained active, American soldiers were at risk. George would go out again on January 24th. The third day of the hunt began with rain, a heavy tropical downpour that reduced visibility to nearly zero and turned the jungle floor into a swamp. George waited in his tent until the rain passed, knowing that shooting in those conditions would be nearly impossible, and that movement would be both difficult and loud. By mid-morning, the weather cleared enough for operations. George moved back into the groves, this time approaching from the south, a direction he had not yet used. He chose his position carefully, a bomb crater approximately 300 yards into the jungle, deep enough to provide cover, but with raised edges that gave him elevation for observation. George settled in and began his watch. Hours passed. The sun climbed toward its zenith, baking the jungle and turning the crater into an oven. George ignored the heat, the thirst, the cramping in his legs from holding position. His entire focus was on finding that 11th target. At 10:06, George saw something that made his blood go cold. He had been watching a cluster of rocks approximately 70 yards northwest of his position, an area that offered good cover and clear sight lines back toward American positions. Through his scope, George saw a Japanese soldier positioned behind a fallen tree trunk near those rocks, his rifle aimed directly toward the drainage ditch where George had operated the previous day. The enemy sniper was not looking at George's current position. He was watching the old position, waiting for George to return to familiar ground. It was a tactical ambush, perfectly executed, and it would have worked if George had followed his own pattern. George realized he was looking at the 11th sniper, the man who had survived by being smarter and more patient than the others. The range was 70 yards, an easy shot by any standard, but George hesitated. Something felt wrong. The Japanese soldier was too exposed, too easy to see. George expanded his search, looking for additional threats, for the real sniper using this man as bait. At 10:08, he found what he was looking for. A second Japanese soldier, approximately 90 yards southeast of the first, positioned in a shallow depression and watching not the American lines, but the area around George's crater. This was the real threat, the 11th sniper, and he had brought support. They were working together, using one man as a decoy to draw George's fire while the other waited to locate and eliminate him. George had a decision to make. His Winchester was a bolt-action rifle. He could fire one shot, work the bolt, and fire again, but that would take 2 to 3 seconds, more than enough time for a trained shooter to locate him and return fire. If he shot the decoy, the real sniper would have him. If he shot the real sniper first, the decoy might locate him before he could chamber a second round. George chose the real threat. He settled his crosshairs on the man in the depression, controlled his breathing, and fired. The 11th sniper collapsed. George worked the bolt with speed born of thousands of hours of practice, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a fresh round. The decoy soldier was already turning, raising his rifle, searching for the source of the shot that had just taken down his partner. George fired again. The second soldier fell. 11 shots fired over 3 days against snipers. 11 kills. The Point Cruz groves were clear. George climbed out of the crater and began the work of recovering his spent cartridges, a habit from his competition, days when ammunition was expensive and brass was reloaded. As he worked, he heard voices, Japanese voices, coming from the tree line to the south. Multiple soldiers were moving toward the area where the last 2 snipers had fallen. George had been so focused on eliminating the targets that he had forgotten to watch for enemy infantry. He dropped back into the crater as rifle fire erupted, bullets striking the ground around him and kicking up dirt. The Japanese were firing at sound and movement, not at confirmed targets, but that made them no less dangerous. George grabbed his rifle and ran. He sprinted north through the jungle, taking a different route than any he had used before, navigating by instinct and memory of the terrain maps he had studied. Japanese rifle fire followed him, cracking through the trees. Bullets struck trunks and snapped branches. George ran for 90 seconds, lungs burning, legs screaming, before diving into another shell crater. He waited there for 5 minutes, controlling his breathing, listening for pursuit. The firing stopped. The voices faded. George had broken contact. At 11:13 on January 24th, George reached American lines. A Marine sentry challenged him, and George identified himself. The sentry led him through the perimeter to battalion headquarters. Captain Morris was waiting. George provided a full debrief. 11 Japanese snipers eliminated in 4 days, 12 rounds fired against the snipers specifically, 11 hits, 1 miss, plus additional rounds fired during the final firefight with Japanese infantry. Morris asked about ammunition. George was down to 2 rounds remaining in his Winchester. Morris commended George's work and told him to clean his rifle and rest. But rest would not come easily. The aftermath and legacy. The immediate impact of George's success was measurable in lives saved. American casualties from sniper fire in the Point Cruz groves dropped to 0 after January 24th. The advance westward, which had been slowed to a crawl by the threat from the trees, resumed at a normal pace. Soldiers moved with confidence instead of fear, knowing that the threat from the canopy had been neutralized. Captain Morris filed a report detailing George's actions and recommending that the battalion establish a formal sniper section with George as its leader and instructor. The recommendation was approved within days. George was assigned to train the first official sniper team in his battalion, teaching the skills that had kept him alive and made him effective in the Point Cruz groves. He emphasized patience over aggression, observation over movement, and precision over volume of fire. He taught his students to read terrain, to understand light and shadow, to move through jungle without sound. He taught them to maintain their weapons with obsessive care, to know their rifles so intimately that they could disassemble and reassemble them in darkness by touch alone. He taught them to shoot not at targets, but at specific points on targets, to aim for the center of mass or the head, depending on range and conditions. George's sniper section continued operations through the final phase of the Guadalcanal campaign. They operated for 12 days during the period when Japanese forces were executing Operation Kei, the evacuation of their remaining troops from the island. During that time, George's team recorded 74 confirmed kills with 0 friendly casualties during sniper operations. They became specialists in eliminating Japanese soldiers who were covering the retreat routes, machine gunners in bunkers, officers directing defensive positions, and remaining snipers who had replaced those George had eliminated in January. On February 9, 1943, American forces reached Cape Esperance on the western tip of Guadalcanal and found it empty. The Japanese had completed their evacuation the night before, pulling out more than 10,600 men under the cover of darkness and destroyer transports. The Guadalcanal campaign was over. It had lasted 6 months, from August 7, 1942 to February 9, 1943, and had cost both sides dearly. The Americans had lost over 7,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. The Japanese had lost over 31,000, including those who died from disease and starvation. The campaign marked the first major Allied offensive victory in the Pacific and demonstrated that Japanese forces could be defeated through sustained combat operations. George's contribution to that victory was small in terms of numbers, but significant in terms of impact and precedent. He had proven that precision shooting by trained marksmen could be a force multiplier in jungle warfare, that one man with the right skills and the right weapon could neutralize threats that an entire company could not locate. His success with a civilian sporting rifle demonstrated that the issue was not equipment, but training and doctrine. The United States military began to take sniper development seriously as a result of experiences like George's on Guadalcanal. The Winchester Model 70 that George used became the basis for official military sniper rifles in later conflicts. During the Vietnam War, the United States Marine Corps issued Model 70s, accurized by Marine Corps Rifle Team armorers and equipped with unertl 8-power scopes to their sniper units. These rifles, firing .30-06 M72 match ammunition with 173 grain boat tail bullets, proved devastatingly effective in the hands of trained marksmen. The most famous Marine Corps sniper to use the Model 70 was Gunnery Sergeant Carlos Hathcock, who achieved 93 confirmed kills during his deployments in Vietnam and became a legend for his patience, skill, and tactical brilliance. Hathcock's rifle, the same model that George had carried on Guadalcanal 20 years earlier, is now on display at the Marine Corps Sniper Museum in Quantico, Virginia. George himself continued to serve after Guadalcanal. He was deployed to Burma, where he applied his sniper skills in a different type of jungle environment against Japanese forces operating in that theater. He trained additional sniper teams, wrote tactical reports on counter-sniper operations, and contributed to the development of doctrine that would be used by American forces for decades. After the war, George authored a book titled Shots Fired in Anger, a detailed account of his experiences on Guadalcanal that provides a rifleman's perspective on the campaign. The book is considered one of the finest first-person accounts of infantry combat in the Pacific War, notable for its technical detail and its focus on the practical realities of fighting in the jungle. The lessons that George taught through his actions on Guadalcanal remain relevant in modern military training. The importance of marksmanship, the value of patience in combat, the need for soldiers to be able to operate independently and make tactical decisions without constant oversight, these principles are foundational to special operations and designated marksman programs in contemporary militaries around the world. George demonstrated that individual skill matters, that technology and equipment are only as effective as the person using them, and that sometimes the solution to a complex tactical problem is not more firepower, but more precision. The Japanese snipers that George faced on Guadalcanal were themselves skilled and dedicated soldiers. They had developed tactics specifically for the jungle environment of the Pacific Islands, using the terrain and vegetation to maximum advantage. They understood concealment, patience, and target selection. They were willing to sacrifice mobility and even the possibility of escape in order to achieve their mission of slowing the American advance. The fact that they held out as long as they did, that they required someone of George's caliber to neutralize them, speaks to their effectiveness as a tactical element. Their defeat was not due to lack of skill or courage, but due to encountering an opponent who matched their abilities and exceeded them in critical areas of marksmanship and tactical flexibility. The story of John George and the 11 Japanese snipers is a reminder that war is ultimately decided by individual human beings making decisions and executing skills under conditions of extreme stress. Technology, logistics, strategy, these are all important. But at the point of contact, it comes down to soldiers on the ground doing difficult and dangerous work with whatever tools they have available. George had a rifle that his fellow officers mocked as a mail-order toy. But he also had years of training, a deep understanding of marksmanship fundamentals, and the mental discipline to apply those skills under combat conditions. That combination made him more effective than an entire company of soldiers equipped with standard military weapons but lacking his expertise. The 4 days in January 1943 when George hunted and eliminated the sniper cell in the Point Cruz Groves represent one of the forgotten but significant small unit actions of the Pacific War. It did not involve thousands of men or major battles that changed the course of the campaign. It was one man with a rifle, working alone or with minimal support, solving a tactical problem that was costing American lives and slowing operations. The fact that George's actions are not as well known as major battles or famous commanders does not diminish their importance. If anything, it highlights how much of war is decided by individuals whose names never make it into the history books, but whose contributions are measured in the lives of their comrades. We often remember World War II through the lens of massive operations, D-Day, Midway, the Battle of the Bulge, engagements involving hundreds of thousands of troops and reshaping entire theaters of war. But the war was also won by individuals like George, specialists who brought unique skills to bear on specific problems, who adapted civilian expertise to military needs, and who proved through action that precision and intelligence can be as valuable as firepower and numbers. The 11 Japanese snipers who died in the Point Cruz Groves in January 1943 were eliminated, not by artillery barrages or airstrikes, but by one man who understood his weapon, understood his enemy, and had the patience to wait for the right shot. If you've made it this far, you now know the story that most people have never heard, the tale of Second Lieutenant John George and his mail order Winchester that changed how America approached sniper warfare. Stories like this, where individual skill and determination made a difference that rippled through military doctrine for generations, are what we bring you on this channel. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next deep dive into the forgotten warriors and battles of World War II. Hit that like button if you appreciate the level of detail we put into these videos. And drop a comment below telling us what other forgotten stories of the Pacific War you want us to cover. The history is out there, waiting to be told, and we're going to keep bringing it to you. The Winchester Model 70 that John George carried through the jungles of Guadalcanal was more than a rifle. It was a statement that skill matters, that training and precision can defeat superior numbers, and that sometimes the best weapon is the one you know how to use perfectly rather than the one the military issues. George's 11 confirmed kills in 4 days saved American lives, proved a concept that would become standard military doctrine, and demonstrated that individual excellence can make a difference even in the largest and most destructive conflict in human history. That is the legacy of the forgotten soldier who hunted Japanese snipers in the Point Cruz Groves of Guadalcanal in January 1943. A legacy written in precision, patience, and the courage to go alone into the jungle against an enemy who had every advantage except one. They were not facing John George.